Hello and welcome to Stories Written and Read by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you'd like to read along to the stories as I read them, you can find a link to my blog in the description below. This is A Hunting Trip. Kenneth had told David about his last hunting trip and his biggest kill more than 2 weeks ago, the circumstances of which he made no pretense of ever being able to top. To put it plainly, he had crept up on a doe and shot it point blank. What lay beyond this one-sentence summary was uncertain. He was sure of the aftermath than of how he had managed to get within arm's length of the doe, a position from which, so he'd said, he could just as well have clubbed it to death as shot it. He went early in the morning to have more of the day to himself, telling his wife where he was going in case of an accident, and that he was going alone. It was quiet on the way there, besides the low rumble his truck made, which retreated into the background and became part of the silence rather than breaking it. He parked near the forest's entrance and began the second stage of his trip on foot, trudging through the wilderness at an hour when he figured most of the animals, those that interested him anyway, had hardly woken up, an hour when he himself had hardly woken up. He had set an alarm and prepared for the trip days in advance. The animals were likely at the same disadvantage he was, if not worse off, a disadvantage he trusted himself to overcome better than they could. His every step made him afraid he was scaring off the very animals he was looking for. The snow crunched incessantly under his feet, and then there was the unnerving sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling. He seemed to hear it whenever he moved his arms, no matter where he moved them. He saw a doe far off in the distance, poking its head out from behind a cluster of small trees. He stopped, waited, and continued walking when the doe turned its head and was no longer looking his way. Kenneth tried to explain the layout of the situation. "Here's where I was." He moved his right hand to the end of the table and put his index finger down to hold his hand up. The doe was here. He put his left hand a quarter of the way to the other end, moved it a little nearer to his right, and let it beat the trees. "Do you get it?" He looked at David expectantly. "No, I don't think I do," David said, smiling as if to say it was his own fault he didn't understand, not Kenneth's. Kenneth's worries increased with the situation's suspense as he inched forward towards the doe. He told himself that he could fool the doe about what he was doing if he did it slowly. Despite the haphazardness with which he'd invented that rule, and despite the noise he was making, the doe stayed put and looked more at the ground than at him. He reached the trees and took cover there. The doe browsed the grass. He watched it ease as he lined up its shot. The doe raised its head and pricked its ears as far as they would go in the time between Kenneth firing the gun and the bullet lodging itself in the doe's left lung. There was a spurt of blood upon the bullet's entry, a spurt that would have been greater had the bullet hit an artery. A trickle issued from the wound from that point on, staining the snow. The doe bolted, heading in the direction Kenneth was looking at, running itself ragged, trying to flee from the sound it had heard and the pain it was feeling. It was a sight to see, the doe turning melodramatic as death approached, and Kenneth, having emerged from his hiding place, standing out in the open to watch it unfold. "Like a headless chicken," Kenneth said. David wondered why he had used this comparison, why he felt he needed one at all. The alternative to this redundancy was to call it what it was, a doe with a bullet-torn lung, and not to adorn it with a phrase. Whether it ran like a headless chicken or like itself, it eventually stopped and collapsed to the ground. As he examined the lifeless body, Kenneth thought through how it had come to lie there. In its last moments, and in the moments shortly preceding them, had the doe known who had shot it? Had it finally seen him after he had fired and made himself conspicuous, or had it run blindly about and missed him? Why hadn't it heard him while he was stomping through the snow? Maybe it had, and it had thought nothing of it. Did it have a death wish? Had it gotten soft in its old age, its ears become less perceptive, and its brain slower to react? Had a life of relative peace dulled its sense of self-preservation? The answers to these questions, assuming he could have known them, had become unknowable. The doe was big for its sex. It lacked the antlers of a deer, which, regardless of their size, lent themselves to being displayed as part of a trophy. They would have made the importance of this kill self-explanatory. It was nevertheless worth his time for the story behind it, the curious occurrence that had built up gradually and ended suddenly. What followed amounted to an incomplete dissection performed with a skinning knife he had fastened to his belt. He cut with an even-handed smoothness, going around bones and ignoring the head altogether. The longer the dough stayed intact, thereby retaining its body heat, the more time bacteria had to spread. He distinguished a skinning knife from the knives David knew from his kitchen by its rounded point, which prevented it from damaging what you were skinning. Kenneth used his finger to trace the outline of such a blade in the air, not caring whether David remembered what he said or the shape he made. As Kenneth removed the lungs, he saw the hole the bullet had made. There was no second hole from the left lung into the right lung, or into another area of the body where the bullet might be. Maybe it had fallen in the snow as he had taken the doe's lungs out, or maybe it was still in there. He shook the doe's lungs, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing that would suggest the bullet was there. He examined the other organs with more efficiency and seriousness. The doe soon lay strewn about in pieces in front of him. For all of what he had done to it, it was unfortunately still recognizable. He could have used the heart and innards as bait, had his wife not forbidden him from storing anything but the meat of his kills in their freezer. Once he fit that in, there was little room for what his wife thought of as the grotesque parts of an animal. He could have put the parts his wife abhorred outside. A Canadian winter gave him a secondary public freezer, larger than the one he had in his house. His wife wouldn't allow that either, he thought. He took the doe's meat and hide, and left its bones and organs for the forest scavengers to eat, along with what other parts of the doe he wasn't allowed to use. That was where his dissection ended. When the scavengers had eaten their fill, and the snow had fallen, covering their tracks, the spot where he had left the doe was wiped clean of any sign it had died there. The next step, the one Kenneth was nearly done with, and which was freshest in David's mind, was to have the hide tanned and tailored. Before Kenneth knew better, he had brought his kills to other tanneries, and was disappointed with them all. There he found Stanley Morgan. The sign on the roof of his shop read, "Morgan's Tannery, Leatherwork, and Alterations." For those whom the meaning of alteration was unclear, the sign in his shop window listed the full range of his services, leaving no one unsure about what he could do. Stanley was the man for hunters who couldn't or didn't want to do the job themselves. He worked with care and with a speed that made up for his thin profit margins, winning himself a reputation among those who knew him. He had a stable of regular customers and called them by their names, a kindness he wanted them to reciprocate. To this end, he introduced himself to new customers and asked for their names. It was part of business, he said, to calm those whom he unsettled with his friendliness. He made a list of what his customers brought him, one column for whom it belonged to, and one column for what they wanted him to do with it. The surer he felt he would remember something, the more urgent it was that he write it down. For all the clothing Morgan worked on, he wore jeans and a simple white shirt. In comparison, his customers were overdressed, especially if they came to him right after hunting to drop off their kills, as Kenneth did. There was so much to their hunting gear, straps and holsters, attachments and more. They had pockets for more than they owned, more than they could feasibly carry while stalking an animal. It didn't bother them. They grew accustomed to the extra weight, and entered the shop as they were, the tallest of them ducking their heads to fit under the low ceiling. The shop was one unit, workroom, counter, and clothing rack, undivided by walls or steps. Had it been a bit smaller, his customers might have had to leave something in the car. Running the shop, Stanley felt, was more pleasant when people took the time to remember one another. Those who called him by his name, such as Kenneth, were in the minority. Kenneth and Stanley could have also recognized each other by the position they took to the tannery's counter, behind it as a proprietor or in front of it as a customer. Had Kenneth crossed paths with Stanley on the street, however, I doubt he would have known who it was. What passed over the counter most often wasn't money, but instead tidbits about Stanley's life that Stanley revealed to his customers when he was in a talkative mood. In these moments, he opened himself up to those around him, and in the next moment, if it demanded that he concentrate on a task, like estimating the cost of a repair, he clammed up. He talked freely about what he had on his mind, the repairs that were giving him trouble, and how his brother and his son Nick were getting on. In rare instances, so rare that Kenneth felt privileged to be a part of them, he talked about why his family had moved here and gone off the reservation. The chief had mismanaged the funds the government provided, helping himself to what was intended for more people than just his inner circle. Stanley told him of reservations in Alberta and in other provinces with more honest chiefs, under whose administration the funds they were assigned found their way to where they were needed most. When enough people got sick of the old chief, they'd vote him out and try the new chief. It was up to them, Stanley declared. He didn't vote. He forfeited that right. His time was better spent in the shop. What Stanley didn't mention was the name of the chief, or of his reservation, or how the reservation system generally worked. Nor did Stanley say the name of the tribe he belonged to. What he said was as much as he had to say for Kenneth to know why he had come here, where natives were an uncommon sight, and to provide an explanation, an excuse of sorts, for his being out of place. He was an expatriate that had hopped borders, and an ambassador from a country within his own. On occasion he visited his brother, whom he had supported as best he could. David pleaded with him to move. He refused. The reservation his brother lived on was equally a failure. His visits showed him signs of decay, signs that were slow to rise to the surface, like the weary looks he saw on the faces of the people there. When they had become visible, they were so glacially slow in going as to be effectively permanent. No quick infusion of money could undo the damage the chief's neglect had caused. God knows what he thinks he's doing, Stanley said, a scowl on his face. I was sick of trying to get by. Everyone's sick of it. I got lucky and I got out. Hearing this, Kenneth had felt an outpour of emotion, which he restrained himself from putting into words. He later realized the spectacle he would have made of himself, and was thankful he had kept silent. For Kenneth, Stanley's story was a tragedy that had elicited fresh feeling. For Stanley, it was a fact that he had thought about and felt saddened by as it had been shaping his life. Now he was over it. Kenneth's pity would have made him uneasy. It's all right, I suppose. I'm not on the reservation anymore, Stanley said. Give it a year or two, and I'll have my brother over here with me. It'll be me, Nick, and him. I think you'd like him. It was Stanley's belief, one founded on loose evidence and firm suspicion, that the chief demanded bribes on construction projects and clamped down on financial reporting to avoid being discovered. The chief's scheme was unoriginal because it was effective, and vice versa. He had taken the money for himself, passing the fault and the decision of how to make ends meet to the managers of the construction company. Their solution was to save on the cost of materials. These flimsy buildings were in constant need of repair. What had been built under previous, less corrupt administrations, whatever their faults besides that, remained standing. They were proof that competent chiefs did exist, and that things could improve. Stanley told him this because he thought Kenneth's view of reservations would otherwise be as one-sided and dour as Stanley's own. Stanley had come to know of the chief's dealings through his son. One day, Nick brought it to his father's attention that his desk had spontaneously broken down. Kenneth imagined Nick sitting down at his desk, laying the full weight of his 14-year-old body on it, whereupon one of the desk's legs broke, sending him and his desk tumbling to the floor. It had survived generations of students who, on average, must have treated it more roughly than Nick had. That was also true of his classmates, who acted like the world belonged to them, and everyone else was borrowing it. It had been a matter of time before a student broke something, and a matter of chance that it had turned out to be Nick. A boy had pulled the door to their classroom off its hinges that same day. Nobody in Nick's class had been injured. This was mainly due to luck. and to the fact that the managers had decided not to skimp on costs where it would be obvious and life-threatening, such as the ceilings and walls. Those involved in the conspiracy were tight-lipped about it. There was no record of what they had done, and thus no way to trace the consequences back to them. Morgan felt it was understood that the school would fix the door and replace Nick's desk. The school had other priorities. Stanley felt it was understood that the school would fix the door and replace Nick's desk. The school had other priorities. Stanley brought it to the principal's attention. The principal, who had received some money from the chief, thanked Stanley for his time and sent him on his way. When Stanley came knocking to ask what was taking so long, the principal evaded his questions with a skill Stanley could have admired were it not being used against him. Stanley demanded answers from the principal or from his superiors. The principal shook his head sorrowfully and said he was doing what he could. The school was on a tight budget. To get the money, he'd have to cut back somewhere else or find a charity willing to help. He fixed the desk in 2 months, a ploy to get Stanley off his back. He replaced the classroom door as the school year was coming to a close. At this, Kenneth had nodded, raising his eyebrows in genuine shock. I see. The sympathy he felt was more than his words could convey. Stanley heard only that Kenneth was listening to what he said, and that he wasn't entirely apathetic about it. Stanley was quick to reassure the customers to whom he told this story that he and his family were in no danger, despite the rumors Stanley believed about the chief. Though Stanley hadn't directly confronted him about it, he undoubtedly knew what had happened. The principal's delaying tactics, Stanley's suspicions, and his dissatisfaction with the state of the reservation, all this pushed him to leave. He had realized in hindsight how his frustrations had mounted and made what had been a possibility into a certain conclusion. Nick must be 16 by now, or nearing it. Kenneth saw him sometimes in the shop, late in the day when he was home from school and helping his father. He took busy work off his father's hands, and when his father wanted to teach him something more complex than what he was used to, he studied his father's example and tried to emulate it. Should Kenneth arrive at the shop and find it empty of customers except for himself, as he had after shooting the doe, he'd watch Stanley as he worked. Nick, too, if he was there. Nick didn't mind being watched. He kept his eyes on his work and didn't look over his shoulder to see who came in, ignoring even the sound of the bell Stanley had attached to the door. As for Stanley, he sprang into action at the bell's ring, setting his work aside for later, whether it was finished or not. He considered wasting a customer's time as bad as personally throwing them out the door. He saw Kenneth coming in, the doe's hide in his hands, and waved as he approached the counter. I got it this morning off a doe, Kenneth said. Nice to see you're bringing in business. What are you going to do with it, Kenneth? He asked. Do with it? Kenneth replied, bewildered. You're going to make something, surely, he said, with the air of taking command. What's it going to be? I hadn't thought that far, Kenneth answered, honest and embarrassed. I'll tan the hide and give you time to think. It'll take 2 months. Could be less. We'll see. I'll be upfront about this. I've got a lot of other work to do. He bent his head towards the counter to examine the hide. That'd be great. I'll leave you to it, Kenneth said. Kenneth and David had a good laugh about that later. He had killed the doe and dressed his kill, and having done that, had little idea of what to do with it besides eat it. For this, Kenneth invited his friends and people from the neighborhood over to grill and to hear how he'd gotten the meat. Kenneth began with a trip to the forest. Remarkably quiet, he called it. And the air was cold. That always makes it seem cleaner, doesn't it? He set the grill on medium heat. The meat would get done in time, but also not interfering with the story. In trying to tell it properly, he might take his eye off the grill, and they shouldn't have to go hungry because of that. As he brought the first platter to the table, everyone tried to take a piece for themselves. He assured them there was plenty there and more to come. He gave his friends the greater share, reserving the worst of it for himself. David had the benefit of knowing what to expect, and this made him acutely aware of where the retelling differed from the original. It was longer than the version he had heard in the bar, though Kenneth cut the explanations he had given David about sneaking up on the doe and about the shape of his skinning knife. Among Kenneth's friends were several avid hunters. They knew what Kenneth knew about hunting, except for the details of how he'd gotten the doe. Stories about hunting and about other things can be shortened to a sentence. You went somewhere, you shot something, or tried to shoot it and failed. This sequence, the number of successful attempts, and what you took home with you, that was what made up every such story. To elevate his hunt above the mere facts of it, Kenneth adapted his story to his setting. He played to the crowd, standing on his toes and raising his hand above his head to show them how tall the deer had been, and imitating how he'd shot it by using his tongs as a rifle, holding the handle end to his eye. I swear, he said gleefully, his words becoming as loaded with absurdity as what they describe. I swear, I was breathing on it. I saw the whites of its eyes, I saw it all, and then, bang, I got him. Again, he mimed shooting with the tongs. They roared at the image he conjured of the doe, too frightened to know where to run, and running anyway, its left lung deflating like a balloon. David buried his face in his hand and was pleased to be able to laugh, pleased to find Kenneth's story affected him as much as it had in the bar, and that it hadn't become stale or any worse for the wearer in the meantime. These jokes and Kenneth's observations about the air were for David the story's new center. The plot of the hunt was only the foundation it was built on. I couldn't see where I'd shot it until it gave up and keeled over, Kenneth continued, after the laughter died down. I took the bullet out for safekeeping. I don't know what to do with the hide, though. By this time, he had grilled all the meat he had and joined his friends at the table. His friends flung suggestions at him and at each other, as if they all had hides and were wondering the same thing. He could make a satchel, a holster, or a wallet. As entertaining as he had tried to be, few people had hung on his every word, especially those seated further away from him. "What are you talking about?" a woman asked. He couldn't see her face, nor could he tell whether she was 2 seats away or 3. "I shot a doe. I don't know what to do with the hide," Kenneth yelled, hoping his voice would reach her. It confused him how that fact, of all he'd said, had slipped past her. "I've got a deerskin rug," she said. "You could get one yourself." "It's a doe," he clarified. "What difference does that make for a rug?" "None, I guess." The woman sitting beside him on his left said they were all great ideas. You could make furniture, a blanket for a couch or something. I don't know exactly. Anyway, you don't have to use what you've got in one go. Save some and think about it, she advised him. "That's what the guy at the tannery told me, to think about it," Kenneth said. "A jacket," he heard David say from his right. David had a way of projecting his voice above the voices of others without shouting or straining his own, a talent for speaking clearly that proved useful in these lively conversations. Kenneth had noticed this when they'd met in the bar that had since become their agreed-upon place to talk. They'd been in the same place at the same time and had become friends because Kenneth, seeing David sitting alone in a booth meant for 4, had joined him to give him company and to get it for himself too. Kenneth had come back from a day of hunting and told David of his exploits. David listened and drank his beer until it was empty. He called for a waiter and held his hand up so the waiter would see where the call had come from. The waiter came, took David's order, and brought him his beer. David went back to being his usual quiet self and gestured to Kenneth to continue talking. Had David been the kind of man who hunted, he would have appreciated the forest as Kenneth did, for what he could take from it, not for the thing itself. David wasn't nervous around blood. He could stand the sight of it when his nose bled and when he cut himself in the kitchen, and kept his wits about him enough to be of use to others when they injured themselves. To go out into a forest with the intent of killing, an intent which carrying a rifle reaffirmed, would make the trip a very different one to the leisurely walk which David preferred to take. He had in the past asked Kenneth if he should go hunting. There was a second question lurking behind that, whether Kenneth would go with him and mentor him. David asked the table at large if someone could please pass the ribs. A man handed him the platter. Kenneth's talk of the doe and of the taste of its meat was reigniting David's thoughts of a hunting trip. At these times, when such a trip seemed least impossible, David's curiosity, his wish to more distinctly see how he and Kenneth differed, overcame his deep-rooted distaste for hunting. Kenneth believed this distaste was present even in the way David approached the subject, as something he wanted to throw himself into precisely because he was repelled by it. Kenneth knew neither he nor David could change that, not that David was necessarily a weak man. Had David made himself go through with it, and had he made Kenneth come along with him for the company and for the safety his experience would give David as a beginner, they would have spent a day proving definitively what they knew to be true in theory. Supposing David shot something, he'd think about what he'd done to some animal who had, when you looked at it, been minding its business. He'd take apart his actions bit by bit, like he would have had to take apart the animal itself if its death wasn't to be totally in vain. And when he had finished philosophizing, he'd probably regret the whole thing. He'd rather have some butcher do his dirty work and leave him to eat what he had paid for with clean hands and a clean conscience. Kenneth realized this the first time David asked him to go hunting. David realized it a while later and stopped asking. Who runs the tannery? David asked. You don't say much about the place. You're right, come to think of it, Kenneth said. He looked for the sentence that would start him off. Have I really never told you? What's the owner's name? What does he look like? David prompted. He's native. He's shorter than me. What does he look like? What tribe is he from? These questions jumped out of him, and once he'd said them, he wished they would jump back in. You've got to give me more to work with. I've never seen one of them in my life. Kenneth hemmed and hawed as he searched for an answer. He has black hair, a round face. He didn't say what tribe he was from. I didn't ask. His son has some resemblance to him. I can't say that's true for all of them. I don't know that many, he said, shrugging as he did so. It's funny. I've seen him more times than I can remember, and I can't actually remember him that well. David took another rib from the platter. Do you know what the government's trying to do? Kenneth asked. No. That's what I figured. Don't worry, I'll tell you. Kenneth was vigilant and well informed on what the government was doing and what it could be planning. Lying in wait were bills to restrict hunting licenses and bills to increase the powers of the government to hand out fines and prison sentences. Lastly, there were bills to tax hunting gear, rifles, and bullets and all. To raise taxes for everyone would be rightfully unpopular. The government's plan was to set prices right at where hunters would pay them. If they paid, let them grumble. The flaw in the plan was that if taxes made hunting prohibitively expensive, the government would collect less than it usually did by being greedy. Another reason I can't go hunting, David chimed in to say. Some of what Kenneth feared was true. Some of it was coming true. The most outrageous of these bills were drafts put forth by politicians who knew they were doomed to fail and who wanted to test the waters for a moderate version of their proposals. As much as he disagreed with their ideas and fought them at the voting booth, Kenneth said it was the cost of living under a government, and like any organization, it wanted to expand its reach. He kept a lookout for the dangers that lay ahead and planned to hunt as he was able. That wasn't enough politics for a bumper sticker, but enough for him to have his say. While we're on the subject, did you know your tailor doesn't have to pay taxes? David asked. You must have gotten mixed up. That can't be true, Kenneth said. He recoiled a little at where the conversation was going. David scoffed. I'm telling you it is. He's native. That makes him tax exempt. If you were native, you could hunt and not worry about bag limits or what's in season. He laid out the scheme he had devised. The law required a certain minimum percentage of native ancestry for you to be recognized as such and receive the associated benefits. He had gotten his genes tested. As a boy, his mother had told him, as his grandmother had told her, that they had some native in them. The two women had given Kenneth the future he put his faith into for a positive result, his high cheekbones and his ruddy complexion. He was hoping they weren't lying, David had said. I don't look like your tailor, but he could be from another tribe. What if you're not native? Well, I'll send the test in for registration and see how it goes. It's not my fault if I can't get in because of an oversight. And those are our taxes that your tailor's using. Why not see what I can do for myself? Kenneth was weary of misleading the government, deliberately or on accident. Keeping within the letter of the law, if not the spirit, gave him ground to stand on in court, should he ever sue or be sued by someone. Remember you said I should make a jacket out of that dough? That was one of your good ideas. To make amends, Kenneth began telling another one of his stories. David hoped today was the day he would want to do more than listen. In a week or two, the idea of a hunting trip would lose its hold over him, but like his attempts to keep his money out of the government's hands, it would never be fully extinguished. For the time being, the two of them were content to think about the future. That was A Hunting Trip, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, you can find the link in the description to my blog, and you, as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.